Thank you all so much for coming. This is a great crowd, and I'm realizing that I should start writing about Mississippi to get this kind of crowd at my events. Note to self. I thought we'd just start off with just a real basic question for all three of you, and that basic question is, what was it about the 1927 flood that compelled y'all to write about it? We'll start with Tom, since you're sitting closest to me.
Thanks, Wiley, and thanks for doing this.
You're welcome, Tom.
Yeah, it's great to be here. We have lots of good friends here. Some we haven't seen in a long time, so we're really thrilled to be here. Thank you. And it's good to be in the Strand, too. In the rare books room. Cool. I hope we're never in here, the three of us, again. For Beth Ann and me, we've been thinking about Katrina a lot. And the slow response of the government to that disaster. And then we'd co-written a short story together called What His Hands Have Been Waiting For, which was about the set in the flood of 1927. It's a book, a story rather, that we worked on over a couple of months, and it was published in an anthology and then a magazine. And my agent, Nat Sobel, who is here in New York, saw the story and called me and said, I like this story, why don't you tell me about it? I said, I don't know, it's just kind of a tossed off story. He said, this should be your next novel, and you and Beth Ann should write it together. So it was our agent's idea.
So I'll echo Tommy's thanks about how nice it is to be here and see so many familiar and friendly faces. Thank you. I moved to Mississippi when I was 30. I'm originally from Chicago. I moved there when Tommy was offered the John and Renee Grisham Writer-in-Residence. And when I moved there, it was the first time I'd heard about the Great Flood of 1927. And I didn't even understand how it was possible that I'd never heard of it before, because it was our country's greatest natural disaster. So just imagine a flood where 3,000 people were rescued from rooftops and barns, but it wasn't 3,000. Just think about 30,000. It wasn't 30,000, it was 330,000 people. It's incredible, right? I mean, 1 million people lost their houses. And when the levee broke, the water came through with twice the force of Niagara, a wall of water 100 feet high, and scooped out the delta for 100 miles. But a lot of the people who lost their houses were poor Southerners. And Herbert Hoover, it was in his best interest to squelch accounts of the flood and pretend that everything was okay, because he wanted to be known as the person who managed the flood. When he heard about the flood, he actually said, I will ride this flood to the White House. And he did. So it wasn't really in the media, and when it was, the people who wrote about it didn't really recognize themselves in the poor Southerners, and so the story wasn't really told. And I was really alarmed that this event that shaped so much of our nation and who our nation became was something I was completely ignorant of. And so it was starting with that Tommy and I talked about the flood, and we read a great book by John M. Barry, which is like the Bible. It's called Rising Tide. It's such a fabulous book, and I really recommend it. And then Katrina happened, as Tommy said, which got us thinking about it again. And of course, if we had known about Bill's book, we would have definitely been able to read that for amazing research and inspiration, because it's such a great book.
Thank you. Thank you. Well,
can they hear you? Can you hear them? No, they can't hear you.
It's all right.
Okay. No, it's not all right.
Here, pass yours down.
No. Was it? Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you for those kind words, I suppose. But I mean, for me, the 1927 flood. Whoa. This is Southern hospitality at its height. The 1927 flood. I came to the flood just by listening to blues music, living up here in New York, and being from suburban Queens and sort of middle class Bayside boy. And I was listening. I came to the flood with songs by like John Lee Hooker and Charlie Patton and all those guys, and there's it's like in the blues music, it's large enough that you can't ignore, and I knew I needed it in my book because of that.
This next question's also so for Tom. So Beth is a poet, and you're a fiction writer, and Bill is a poetic fiction writer. Tom, what is it about Beth Ann's poetry that makes her fiction so strong?
That's a great question, Wiley. Thank you. Beth Ann has always written great narrative poems. She wrote one that I love called Madame L. Describes the Siege of Paris, which always seemed like a novel to me. When Paris was surrounded and the people within were starving to death. They weren't going to they weren't going to bust in and kill them violently. They were going to let them starve slowly to death. And Beth Ann read diaries and soldiers' journals and recreates this, to me, unknown event in history. I remember we were, in fact, traveling to Paris on an airplane. My first trip to Paris, we got engaged there on this trip. I was secretly going to ask her to marry me on the plane on the way over there. I knew this.
Yeah, it wasn't so secret.
Anyway, in her guidebook, I see her write poem ? And I read later what it, and it was describing the flood. It's on my mind. The zoo being bombarded by the people who lived in Paris, and they ate the animals. It's amazing. It's a great story, and it's from one narrator, Madame L. And it's always seemed to me like a novel in about 7 pages and in blank verse. So she's always had the ability to write beautiful narrative poems as well as lyrical poems. And what Beth Ann and I like most in novels, hey Tommy, is lyricism, but also a sense of story, a page-turning kind of story. And we have that philosophy in common. And I found this, she writes poems that are page-turners. And now that she's done fiction, I'm not surprised that it's also page-turning fiction.
Yeah, and I'll agree that it is. I mean, the parts that Beth Ann wrote in the novel are really propulsive and compelling pages. So, Beth Ann, I have a similar question for you. I don't know that Tom's ever written poems. Maybe you have in high school.
Yeah.
About how no one would ever understand you.
Really bad ones.
We all wrote those. So, what elements of Tom's work seem the most poetic to you in his fiction? Are there images or is lyricism?
Well, I hope that some of you have read his novel, Crooked Letter, and the reason why I love that novel so much, there are several reasons, but one is I do feel it is a page-turner. You're reading for plot. You care what happens. The characters are in danger. You are involved in their escapades, and you worry about them. But there's beautiful scenery, and there's beautiful images, and the sentences are beautiful. And I have so many writer friends, and some of them, write page turners, and you're done, and you feel like you should shower, And then there's others who write really beautiful sentences, and then you put the book down that night, and you look at it the next day, and you think, you enjoyed it while you were in it, but there's nothing drawing you. There's no question that needs answering. And for me, Tommy's writing does both. And so I knew when we embarked on this project together that if we could achieve that, that would be wonderful. That was a goal.
The next question's for Bill. So, Bill, in Southern Cross the Dog, you've got Robert, who his parents, he loses his parents in a camp. They pawn him off to a woman who owns a cat house, I guess is the nice way to say it. You have a guy who's released from prison to be in a blues band to play the piano. You've got a girl who's basically enslaved, and then you've got these wandering Cajuns who are these land people who are turned out because of these land developers. So everybody in this novel faces tragedy, like deep, deep tragedy. So my question to you is, where'd you get these blues from? What is it that made you so sad that you had to write about this? I mean, this is tragic.
Wow. Oh boy, I don't know. Maybe Chinese American suburban kids are the saddest people in the world.
And I'm glad you said that, because I have a theory. No, but I wonder, was it the effect of listening to the blues growing up? I mean, I know you're from that. That's the tradition.
I think that's part of it. Right? I think certainly, the book is as much a love letter to the blues as it is a way for me to talk about something that's not easy, that doesn't fit into normal words, doesn't fit into a conversation. And I think rather than think of the blues as a seed, I think of it more as a gate. And it's I mean, I think we've all had, in some, lives that have both good and bad in it, and I view bad in a particularly magnified way that dwarfs the way I view the good, and that's just me. I don't know, and the blues was for me a way to both have that and to be okay with having that. It was a way for me to say misery is not necessarily the same as loneliness. And so you can have. Well, I'm not miserable. Let me just put that. I'm actually fairly happy-go-lucky. This is like my fourth one. But it's a way to sort of be okay with that part of yourself and because Robert Johnson was okay with that part of himself, and Muddy Waters was okay with that part of himself, and Blind Willie McTell was okay with that part of himself, and then it's sort of great that's already done for you, and then you can just sort of sit in it and be immersed in it.
Can you talk about some of like the archetypes or the imagery you borrowed from the blues that you put in the book? Like we've got the dog, we've got travel, we've got the devil, we've got all these things. So
yeah, that's all of it. That's pretty much.
Well, then next question.
I mean, very much so. We talked about the flood, which I want to say came from Charlie Patton's High Water, but my first encounter was within John Lee Hooker's Tupelo. There is the dog, which famously shows up in Robert Johnson's Hellhound on my trail. What else is in this damn book? The epilogue the first line of it is taken from, I don't know who the originator was, but the first time I really heard it was from Lightning Hopkins. I don't know, it's all Hoochie Coochie Man, which is a huge muddy. So for those who don't know, there's a kind of southern black folk practice called hoodoo, and there's a kind of bastardized version of that in the book, and it's a kind of folk tradition where it's based on luck and fortune and that sort of thing, and that's in the book. Yeah, all of it's in there. Yeah.
I've heard Jess Walter, who's also a HarperCollins author, whose book's for sale downstairs, called Beautiful Ruins. But I've heard him say he wrote a short story called Don't Eat Cat that kind of made fun of zombies, because he was talking about how as Americans we get to fetishize the apocalypse. We get to kind of talk about the apocalypse as a what if, and we make The Walking Dead and we have the Hunger Games, but in Syria it is the apocalypse. In North Korea it's the apocalypse every day. In Rwanda it's the apocalypse every day, but here we get to play with it. But in 1927 it was the apocalypse in Mississippi. So I'm wondering, and this is for all of you, and whoever wants to answer can answer, all three of you can answer. Were you thinking about, the Tilted World is pre-apocalyptic primarily, and then Southern Cross the Dog is post-apocalyptic. So were you thinking about that stuff when you were writing this? The apocalypse, maybe?
Tommy, tell him about the initial short story that became our short story.
Well, I teach fiction writing at Ole Miss, and I get lots of stories about cancer and cats.
And dead grandmothers?
Yeah, that's right. I got tired of cancer and cats and dead grandmothers, often in the same story. So I decreed one semester it's going to be a zombie apocalypse workshop. You have to write stories with flesh-eating zombies in there. And everyone loved the idea, and everyone wrote stories about it, but they weren't very good. And I thought, well, if I'm making them do this, I better try it myself. I love the zombie genre. I love Night of the Living Dead, the George A. Romero films, Dawn of the Dead. And so I wrote one myself. In my zombie story, two guys are riding through a zombie apocalypse, Ingersoll and Ham Johnson, on motorcycles. And they find a baby in a basket near a scene of violence. And Ingersoll can't leave the baby alone. And Ham says, I'll leave it. They'll eat it. Ingersoll can't leave it. And they take this baby and give it to the first family they find, and it's sort of implied that the family's going to eat the baby. And Ingersoll feels bad and goes back and kills the family, and they rescue the baby. It was just an awful story.
Let it be noted that the entire front row is laughing at that prospect
Well, they all know
of
me
eating
as
a
lying.
baby.
They all know. So a friend of mine, Carolyn Haynes, edited a book called Delta Blues, and she called me and said, "I want a story from you." And I said, "All I have is a zombie apocalypse story." She said, "I don't want that. But if you set it in the 27 flood, maybe I'll be interested in it." So I didn't have time, but I asked Beth then, I said, I'm crushed here with work. You're between projects. You want to try to take this bad story and set it in the flood and make it good? And she said, "I'll try it." And she researched the flood and did, I thought, great job. And suddenly we had a whole new story when she had revised it. So I respect the zombie genre, but I'm happy that the story does not have zombies in it. Because as Beth Ann said, she's more interested in the human heart than the zombie heart. She said it better than that.
I think we don't need zombies to make life interesting. I think people are so weird they'll do anything. We don't need flesh-eating zombies to have people push to their limit. And an event like the 1927 flood is an event that shows people who they really are. And if at any moment out there in the world, there's like Bonnie and Clyde, or there's someone who's a dramatic person doing a dramatic thing, a crime or something crazy. But in a natural disaster, something crazy happens to ordinary people. And ordinary people can find out what they're made of. And I've always been interested in ordinary lives, especially ordinary lives as revealed through a moment of drama. So to me, and again, thinking about Katrina, our friend in Belgium called and said, are you okay? Are you okay? And I said, yeah, we're in northern Mississippi. I mean, we lost a bush, So my Katrina story was not having a Katrina story. But in Katrina, everyone down there had a story. Something happened to them all, no matter how calm they were. They all had that story. And I think that's what's interesting about a time of violence or a time of disaster, is that people have the story of their lifetime. And I was thinking about how interesting it is when you don't choose drama, but drama befalls you and you have to endure it.
I think that's right. For me, it was very much about, I'm 30 years old, and for me, it's
Everyone in this room hates you right now.
Yeah, you're a baby. Yeah.
But I sort of, when I was in college, a lot of shitty things happened that I had no idea was ever going to happen, and it's. I don't want to say it's informed my worldview, because I don't believe that, but I do believe that there was a certain unique feeling about what life is like in those sort of coming, weeks, months, years, that but that everything is very fragile in the way that I didn't expect anything to be this fragile before, and that's what I don't know. That's necessarily post-apocalyptic, because we're all still. Yeah, more or less quite fine.
Are you trying to say you were very sheltered?
I'm pretty sheltered. I'm nice and pudgy and just well kept. But yeah, but I think, I don't know. It was at the time I was writing the book. It was important to me. It was personally important to me to really just chase this idea of what, like, why, not even why, but what is this fragileness that has suddenly surrounded my worldview for however long it did. I think we're at this certain point where we're very interested in zombies and post-apocalypse, because I would like to, I am kind of interested in that, and it's because we're all. It sort of belies the idea that we're all sort of waiting for the world to end. And the question of why we're waiting for the world to end is a very interesting one to me.
Yeah. But I think maybe the American South has a particular history of the world ending. Post 1865, the South was a third world country. And I see that in your characters, Frankie and Boss John and Roan, these river people.
Thank you so much.
that's like a wine angel. That's never happened in
This is
any
one of
event
my
I've ever been to.
One of my college roommates.
Yes.
Many of my nights have ended with
Strand.
the last thing I'm remembering is Denise bringing me a shot. You know? So watch
And telling you
I've
to
been
smell this
warned.
cloth.
It's Jägermeister for all is like probably the next step. So, you know.
But I guess I'm just thinking about the South being regenerative. So we have, the Civil War, we have the Flood, we have the Great Depression, we have all these things where the South just keeps having to start over, So the South's always been ending, and it's always been, trying to begin again. And I'm wondering if y'all are thinking about that, these people being displaced, of having to begin again and having to recreate culture. Like New Orleans after Katrina is very different, it's much more expensive, and a lot of the people left. A lot of the people who created the culture left, So I wonder if y'all were thinking about that when you were thinking about these people in Mississippi.
Well, our novel, in our novel, The Flood takes place about 3/4 of the way through. And that's why I think Bill's novel is so wonderful, because his novel deals with the aftermath of the flood. And we weren't really dealing with people recreating their life. We were dealing with people having this like giant trauma in their life. But the people who were on the levee, like, why are there so many great blues songs from this period, songs that Bill talks about in his novel? It's because a lot of these people were stuck on the levee. Some of them were poor black sharecroppers, and they were forced to stay there because the cotton merchants were scared that no one would be around to pick the cotton. So they were forced to stay there under gun by the National Guard, and so they had nothing to do. So there was a blues renaissance. I mean, they had nothing to do, so they made music. They made art out of tragedy, and then as soon as they could, they left to go to Chicago. So it changed our nation. The flood changed our nation it was a big part of the Great Migration. And also, because of the flood in 1927, we have FEMA, for better, for worse, those of you who survived Hurricane Sandy. Because at that point, there was no official national response to tragedy. Like, literally, if something bad happened, the government went, oh. That was it. There was no money, there was no support, nothing. And so because of that, the government changed a lot of its policies. So this whole idea of like rebirth and recreation and change wasn't something that we dealt with in our novel, though it was certainly part of the time. I think Bill deals with it really beautifully.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think with my characters, they're all sort of fucked up by this thing that happened to them, and they're not to ruin it for you, but they're done. They're screwed. But I think with especially with Dixie Clay and with Ingersoll, they in a way they find the things that's missing from themselves, right? That in sort of the wake and circumstances of this trauma, they get to have that kind of family that they didn't even know they were missing until they knew.
Yeah, and to touch on that a little bit, their book is kind of about progress being emotional and organic, and yours is with the shining new South, progress being forced upon people and bulldozing the wetlands and digging everything up and blowing all this stuff up, and I guess that's progress of a kind too.
Am I letting
right?
my political colors show?
Yeah. So this is might be our final question before we take questions from the audience. I hope they have some. So both of these books portray race relations and injustice. Robert's brother is lynched. We're assuming it's because of some kind of sexual indiscretion with a white woman. Then he finds himself in an interracial relationship that he's hesitant to pursue with Frankie. Y'all's book touches on the African Americans being left behind on the levee, like you were just saying, to be sharecroppers. So, but the flood kind of redefines a lot of that. Like, everybody's stuff's destroyed. Everybody has to start over. And I'm wondering if y'all saw either this flood or if you see nature as the great equalizer. Is nature kind of smacking down these fake things that we create around ourselves to say this or that, if that was...
Well, I didn't, but I do now.
Yeah, me too.
Because so much of it is about race, and when you think about race, especially, in civil rights and pre-civil rights, you think about Mississippi. That's where Emmett Till, that's where that happened. That's where a lot of the civil rights struggles happen. They say in North Carolina to undermine race progressiveness, you joined the Ku Klux Klan. In Mississippi, you joined the police force. You know, so I'm wondering if y'all are thinking about that, about nature saying like, no, you know, we're not going.
I don't think we're thinking about that originally. I think, at least for me, I don't think about anything when I start to write. I just go with an image or an idea or a character, and the thinking comes later. And that's, to me, the scary part.
Yeah.
When you realize there are implications to what you've written. The more challenging part is making something up out of nothing. And, you know, and later looking more closely at it and seeing what it might mean, you know, and also what you might have thought at the time.
I'm the exact same way. That's me to a T.
Yeah. Doesn't make good for good answers for questions.
But what images did you what images did you start with for this? For all three of you, what images were in your mind when you?
For me, it was a baby in a pot, you know, but that was the original story.
Yeah.
Which we edited out. No baby gets cooked in the making of this novel.
Yeah, weirdly enough, it was also a baby in a pot. No, it was it was a group of kids like right before the flood happens, and then they sort of have this sort of precious moment together, and there's this boy who had something terrible happen to his family, and the flood happens, and for the rest of his life he thinks that the flood happens for a reason, and so that was the image for me.
Are there any questions that folks in the audience have about these two wonderful books? This is the best part. This is the writer's favorite part. Yeah.
For Tom and Beth Ann, I'm curious about the dynamics of co-writing a book. I can't imagine how such a thing is done.
This
me
is Josh
too.
Gaylord, who's written two wonderful novels that I know of. One, Hummingbirds, and one, The Reapers Are the Angels, which is a zombie novel, people.
But what I was wondering was, you know, I can see negotiating about the characters or plot lines, but I always thought that actual written narrative style is almost like a fingerprint for a writer. And how do you negotiate two different fingerprints in terms of styles?
Go ahead.
Well, very carefully. My cousin said when he heard Beth Ann and I were writing a novel together, Tom, he said, that's high-stakes poker. And we wondered if we would come to loggerheads about something, if we would disagree about a plot point. We never did, ultimately. In the case of The Tilted World, I will confess to this New York crowd that my wife wrote more than I did. I kept being called away for crooked letter duty. And, you know, and to write a book, one needs long stretches of time. One needs to be there every day in the same place. And I kept not being there in the same place. But I would come home. Beth Ann had been there in the same place. She would have written a whole new chapter. We had mapped out our book. She would do Dixie Clay Holliver, the female point of view, and I would do Ted Ingersoll, the male point of view. And we had it all figured out. You know, we would just write a chapter, and she'd write a chapter, I'd write a chapter, and they would just be, you know, perfect, dovetailed together perfectly. However, my worst nightmare was this. She would have her part finished, and mine wouldn't even have begun. And that's exactly what happened. And that's kind of like our lives. I mean, she's an A student, I'm a C- student. But I would come home from a trip, and she would say, I've got a whole new chapter. And I would say, great, sweetheart. And I'd be happy for her, and kind of for me, because it's also my book, so it's like I wrote half a chapter, right? But not really. So I would feel a little bit, you know, envious and sad. And finally, really, Dixie Clay's chapters were all done. And Ingersoll's were not even started. So we sat down together and wrote Ingersoll's chapters. And then it got really fun. Because the writers in the crowd know that being a writer is very lonely. You sit there by yourself every day. If you're a male, your prostate swells.
Oh my God.
And swells and swells. And you're alone by yourself. It's why writers become alcoholics, right? Because you sit there in your head all day.
She's why we become alcoholics.
Yeah. But anyway, Beth Ann called it dueling laptops. We sat in her tiny office in our house together, you know, kneecap to kneecap, and we would discuss what scene had to be written. Ingersoll on the levee confronting Jesse. That would be the scene, and we would talk about it. I would write a version, she would write a version. We would email them back and forth, you know, this far from each other, and read each other's and keep what was best out of each. So in that way, if you do the math, she did about 75% of the book, and I did about whatever's left, if you do the math.
about Josh's question, how did the voices mesh? And one really nice compliment we've gotten from some of our writer friends is when they say, yeah, I was reading to see a big transition from when one of you stopped and one of you began, and I never saw the seam. And I really love that compliment. But I think that partially, even though this is the first time Tommy and I have collaborated on a novel together, we met the first day of graduate school 1,000 years ago. We've been together 19 years now. And this whole time we've been together, we've been writing and sharing each other's work. And what do you think of this? And is this a good sentence? Is there anything here? And I think, in a way, all of that was preparing us to write this novel. We just didn't know it was in our future. And all that time I've spent loving Tommy's writing and reading his beautiful sentences, and it's been training my own ear. And I think maybe it's not really that much of a surprise that when I turn to fiction writing at last, my voice comes out in harmony with his.
It was really intimate in a surprising way, because again, the writers in the audience know that your first draft is often terrible. My first drafts are really stinking piles of shit. There's no other way to say it. And I take that pile and I push it around for a bit and make like little Play-Doh shapes out of it or something. But here I was doing that in front of somebody for the first time. Even if Beth then saw something of mine, I would have had it, for a few days or a few weeks. Here she was seeing it right out of the head, which is scary. And if we hadn't been together for almost 20 years, I would never have been able to do that. So again, it was, I think, a very special circumstance that allowed us to do this.
Anyone else? Yes.
You brought up a point about that you didn't realize about the flood, and I said in the same way. But at the time, obviously, it wasn't a media-saturated world. It probably would have linked on CNN endlessly there were today. But was it, obviously it had an influence on the country going forward, but at the time, was it a national, or was it more the Mississippi event?
Right. So the question from the front row is, at the time, was the event, the flood of 1927, a Mississippi event or a national event? And I would say it was a national event. The area that was flooded was the size of New England. And the water stayed for 6 months. So imagine if it was now, imagine if New England was flooded now. It would be on everyone's radar. It would be in the history books, and there would be tremendous, it would be a worldwide response. And at the time, the president was Calvin Coolidge, and he didn't even come. And everyone wrote to him. All 5 senators sent him telegrams and messages and said, please come, please come. You need to turn the eyes of the world on the Delta. And he never came. He didn't want to be associated with the flood. Of course, there are some parallels with Katrina that you all could probably draw.
Yes, ma'am.
This question is for Bill. You said that your characters never succeeded. They were disaster. Are you saying that people cannot face disaster and pull themselves up and make something out?
I think that's sort of, proven in the Tilted world that, and I do, like, that's what reality is like. That is, hand in hand with the horrible things that we are and that we become, there's also this sort of magical and wonderful part of us, ready to balance that out, ready to sort of rescue this sort of orphan baby we know nothing about, and the sort of, criminal woman that we are sort of programmed in our career to sort of fight against, and we can sort of rise above that. That's just not the scope of my novel, which is goth as hell. Now, I don't know. I suffer from that thing where it's so much harder to write compellingly about hope than it is to write about despair. And it's first book. Give me some time. Just give me a minute.
Yes.
I'm having an ongoing discussion with some of my own writing professors about the idea that literature isn't inherently designed to convey a message. And it's certainly a very worthwhile goal to write a book about ordinary people experiencing something extraordinary. Was there any kind of underlying message that you were trying to deliver through the vehicle of the novel?
Go ahead.
No. No message, just a story, hopefully. And if there's a message, for you, great. But really, I don't want to do any kind of preaching at all.
To get back to Bill's question, when a big disaster comes or some violence, there's all these stories that come out of it, and a lot of the stories are stories of despair and tragedy, but there's always going to be times when someone's life turns around. And, being here in New York, of course, I think about 9/11, and of all the stories of 9/11, one that's always stuck with me, and actually the first time I read about it, I just wept like a child, was a firefighter who had a trained dog who was trained to dig bodies out of rubble. And the second day, the dog couldn't get any bodies out of the rubble. And by the third day, the dog was depressed. And the firefighter could see the dog was not okay. The dog was upset. He'd been trained to rescue bodies, and everyone he was pulling out was dead. And the firefighter got his friend to hide in the rubble so the dog could dig down and get him out. And when I think of that story, I think that's the greatest part of human nature and life on Earth. And that came out of the terrible tragedy of Katrina. And, out of 9/11. And, in our flood, our characters are fictional. But it does make me think that there are going to be unhappy people who find each other in a flood like that. Our novel is, in a way, about how you form a family in a non-traditional way. Sometimes some people get lucky and they fall in love and have happy babies and life is good. Some people need tragedy to find each other, and in our novel, the people who find each other weren't supposed to be happy people, but they got happy.
Spoiler alert.
Sorry, whoops.
Still buy it, please.
I need a gag.
Any other questions? Yeah, John.
When you're writing about a particular part of history that's, also, while some people don't know about the flood, it's still kind of deep in the conscious of our national history. Is it a challenge to kind of break out of like the historical perspective? Was that something you ran up against, where it starts to sound like a period piece? And how do you break through that? Just write history and, like you said, telling a story.
You want to talk about that?
Oh no, I don't. I was given John Barry's book after I'd finished my, third or fourth draft, and I suppose I'm one of those sort of fiction writers that's not afraid with getting things wrong, because I get a weird satisfaction. This is not to sound perverted, but I get a weird satisfaction from passing off something I completely made up as a possible fact, and that for me is a source of great joy. I don't know why. And I think this is sort of I'm thinking about this in terms of a writing point of view, and I think the way to free yourself from anything is to let air into it. Right, is to sort of let yourself be wrong or let yourself try something that is not expected. And for me, it wasn't. I didn't really feel like I was being held down by history.
Well, I wish I had Bill's confidence. I think it's amazing to have written his book and read John Barry's book later. And, he never went to Mississippi. And I promise you, if you read his book, you will think that he lived there, He never went to Mississippi before he came on book tour. Is that crazy? Whereas, meanwhile, I'm the A student who, researched everything, and I was nervous and, worried that we'd get it wrong. And I gave up in my own way, but what freed me was a different kind of research, not the research about the statistics, but the primary documents. For me, what was really useful was reading people's letters who had survived the flood and hearing them speak in their own words with their great Southern expressions, describing this to a loved one. Was great. Reading journals. So we went to the Flood Museum and we did all sorts of archival research, and hearing them speak in their own words about what they went through was way more valuable than reading books by historians about what actually happened, because they would speak in ways that you could visualize things. And I remember reading one account of the flood where a woman was talking about seeing a house spinning over like this, and there was a boy, a young boy, preteen boy, and as the house was turning, he was running like a barrel race, trying to stay afloat, and the waters were rushing, and he was leaping over the corners of the house, and then she saw him go down. And when I read that, I knew we would have to use it. You know, it was so visual. I understood its power. And so it was finding those primary documents that let me kind of forget what I knew, that I had to like be the A student first before I could give up. So you really saved yourself a lot of time, Bill. Really, you know.
Well done.
Yeah, well done.
Well, I don't know about that. No, it's not my turn to talk. I've already done my talking part.
Go ahead. You can talk.
I think that's right, because this question comes up a lot. For me, because I'm not from Mississippi and I don't have the privilege of being able to live there, it's that for me, I did a ton of research, but the research was more about finding those details, right?
Yeah.
Finding those really interesting, like compelling, like heartbeats that's in the research. That's not so much about, okay, how much land area or well, that's actually kind of important, how much land area. But all right, what happened to this particular structure, like at the time of the flood? That's not as important as say, why am I reading this right now? What about me, and what about what I'm trying to find out is so interesting that I'm still researching, and it's trying to capture that sort of weird, invisible thing that when you're at that point in your work that you can't let go of, and it's sort of. The way I've been describing it is that you're communing with your book before it's written in the way you research.
Cool.
Yes, ma'am.
Speaking about your research, how do you make your notations about it in the age of the computer? Where are your index cards?
Yeah, so the question in the front row was, in the age of the computer, how do we like literally use our index cards, or how do we make notes and keep track of our research? You want to talk about that?
The secret. All my life.
I don't know.
There's special programs that you use?
No? Is there an answer to this
Yeah,
question?
I mean, the truth is I'm not a computer person, so I still use index cards. Like, I know that's a really disappointing answer.
And I use a dry erase board where, with different
Yeah.
colors for different characters. So, it's still very much, it seems very primitive, too. I'm writing in notebooks. I'm taking notes all the time. But also, it's high-tech in that I'm writing on a computer and I'm moving blocks of text around. So it's a strange explosion of the old and the new in a not very pleasant way. I really don't enjoy the act of writing. It's way more fun to have written.
Yeah. Yeah, this is fun.
This is great.
Yeah.
With wine and friends and almost no more questions. We're nearing the end.
I have one more question before we wrap up. Aside from some of the stuff y'all have mentioned, if these folks can't go to Mississippi or haven't experienced Mississippi music or food or literature, what is something that the three of you would recommend? Like, this song is Mississippi, this dish is Mississippi, this novel.
These two books are Mississippi.
Good night.